If you're like me, you have become accustomed to the busyness of life, and very rarely, if ever, do you seek solace or comfort, consolation in stillness. In those moments of life where you just stop and you breathe. Because I don't know about you, but even though it's relatively awkward, there was something very tranquil about just sitting there in silence. For me, I don't know about you, like obviously it's awkward because everyone's just staring at me, waiting for me to do something. But there was also this good moment where I could just breathe and there's a peace to it. Well, rarely, if ever, do we truly find this time to pull away from the busyness of life and seek this solace or seek this consolation in the stillness. In fact, I'll go even a step further this morning and say that many of us, we are culturally conditioned against this type of experience. And here's what I mean by that is that we as a culture have adopted this mentality of filling our lives with all this busyness, with all this white noise. We as a culture, we just fill our schedules, and any wasted moment is a wasted moment. Any time that's not being used for something, we got to try to fill it with something. And so we've accustomed ourselves to filling our lives with busyness and this white noise. But even on a practical level, we are accustomed and we are conditioned to constantly multitask. How many of you like to multitask? Raise your hand. I love multitasking. How many of you, the thought of multitasking already makes you start to panic and freak out because you're going to start messing up stuff? All right, so I honestly thought there was going to be more of that because my mom's this way. We talked, and one day she came in while I was doing homework, and she was like, what are you doing? And I was just listening to music. She's like, I don't know how you do that. Like, I need you to turn the music off so I can focus. Well, for me, just one example is that I physically cannot work very productively as far as if I'm doing schoolwork, if I'm preparing a sermon. It's hard for me to do the mundane writing stuff if I don't have background noise. So I will listen to music. I'll put on music, and even if I don't hear what's going on, if I don't listen to it, just having the background noise behind me makes me so much more comfortable. I don't know why. Like I can surely focus on the task at hand if music is playing. So all throughout the night, you'll hear music playing if I'm working because I just can't focus. If not, if you're like that, raise your hand. Okay, good. So there's a few of you like that. So that's my solace in a way, is I get away, I play music, and I focus on stuff. But here's the thing is despite our tendency to fill our lives up with this busyness, with this white noise, I want you to know something, that there is still a great need, a big, huge need in our life to get away, to withdraw, and to seek solace in the stillness, and in the silence more specifically. And so with that, this morning, we're going to look at the power of stillness. We're going to look at the impact just taking moments of stillness, withdrawing from life, can have on our life. And more specifically, I want to show you that this premise was set forward by the master teacher, by the Savior, Jesus Christ himself. And so if you have your Bible this morning, join me in the Gospel of Luke as we begin in Luke 5. Luke 5, right after Matthew, before Mark and John. Actually after Mark. Luke, yeah. After Mark. Luke's Gospel, chapter 5, is where we're going to begin this morning. And in Luke 5, he begins by recording Jesus calling his first disciples. And if you were here for VBS, we had the opportunity to teach all of our younger students about this. And we told them the story about how Jesus called these ordinary fishermen, these ordinary guys. We talked about how they were smelly and gross. And Jesus took these ordinary fishermen and he did something extraordinary with them. He made them fishers of men instead. So Jesus literally changed their vocation. He called them to step out of their current mission, and he called them to do this. He called them to witness the greatest mission of all time. And that mission is where God would reveal his greatness in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Greatest mission on earth. Not Apollo, not all these other things. It was God revealing himself in the personal work of Jesus Christ. And so they left their vocation of being fishermen. Jesus called them to be fishers of men, and it was to witness the greatest mission ever, which was God revealing himself through the personal work of Jesus Christ. They got to see some incredible miracles and incredible things, and that process began immediately after that as Jesus began his work of healing those who are afflicted. So Jesus began, right after he calls his first disciples, he just starts. He starts doing these awesome things. So if you have a Bible, look at Luke 5. We're going to look at verses 15 and 16. But 12 through 14 records this moment where Jesus is cleansing a leper. And so he cleanses this leper and he sends him. He says, look, I don't want you to speak about this, but instead, I want you to go to your priest and show him as proof of what I've done. So the very peculiar thing that Jesus says, he says, I don't want you to go telling the world. I want you to just go show your priest and and let that be proof. And what that's going to do is that's going to show that Moses, what he had said is true about me, that I am the Son of God. And so he says to go do that. And in verse 15 and 16, notice what it says. It says this, it says, but now even more the report about him, speaking of Jesus, went abroad. That word went abroad just means to spread. His fame was spreading like wildfire. So it says, but now even more, because of what he was starting to do, his report, his image, his, what people thought about him, it was starting to spread abroad. And it says that because of that, great crowds gathered to hear him. And they gathered to be healed of their infirmities or their sicknesses. It says this in verse 16. It's a very powerful little stop. It says, but he withdrew to desolate, which means uninhabited places where people weren't. Jesus went where no one was, so he could just get alone and pray. So there's a very powerful thing there this morning. But what happens here is this verse presents a very intriguing dichotomy or contrast is taking place, because what we see is that there is a immense public recognition of who Jesus is and what Jesus was doing. His fame was spreading. Jesus was gaining all this public recognition. But we also see Jesus' response to that, because Jesus privately retreats. So as his public recognition is rising, notice what Jesus does is we find Jesus starting to privately retreat. So there's a very cool contrast that's taking place there. But that same idea is presented multiple times throughout the Gospels. And so if you want to, look with me at Matthew 14, another one of the Gospels, and this portrays the same kind of idea. Matthew 14, the first 10 verses, it shows that John the Baptist was beheaded. And so the disciples came, and it says that the disciples took his body and they buried him, and then they go to tell Jesus. And so after hearing about the death of his cousin, John the Baptist, it says that, in verse 13, it says that Jesus heard this, and as a response, what does it say he did? It says he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. So again, we're seeing that Jesus, faced with the tragedies and the difficulties of life, of mundane things, of everyday things, Jesus is withdrawing. And now specifically in this case, Jesus is dealing with the flat-out murder of his cousin. And so faced with tragedy, what does Jesus do? He withdraws and gets alone so he can be by himself, so he can pull back from all the crowd. So again, we see that phrase, we hear that phrase, Jesus withdraws to desolate or uninhabited places. However, here's the thing. The crowds hear about this and they follow Jesus. So Jesus is trying to get away. He's trying to pull back and trying to spend time with just himself and God and the Father. And here's what happens is the people hear about it, and so the people decide to follow Jesus, and that leads to another incredible miracle. And Jesus, it says that he feeds upward of about 15,000 people with 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread. Now, this is traditionally referred to as the feeding of the 5,000, but what we learn about is that in Matthew 14:21, it says that there were 5,000 men. But then it adds something to it. It says, besides the women and children. So we talked about this before. Is often we grew up and we heard people talking about how Jesus fed 5,000 with these five things, two loaves of bread, or 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread. But here's the cool part is he didn't just feed 5,000. He probably fed upwards of about 15,000, because this is just the men. This isn't counting the women or the children. And so Matthew gives us that little bit of a detail, and it says that he fed all these people, roughly 15,000, with 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread. And notice what happens immediately following this incredible miracle. So he had fed all these people. They're satisfied. They're content with what they have. In Matthew 14:22, the Bible says this. It says, immediately he, speaking of Jesus, who made the disciples get into the boat and go before him. He said, y'all go ahead. He says, go ahead to the other side. Notice what he did. It says that he dismissed the crowds. He started separating everybody. He said, all right, y'all are good to go. Y'all are dismissed. Head out. And it says, and after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, what do we see? He was there alone. So again, we see this principle that Jesus is dismissing crowds. He withdraws from the public to privately meet with God. It says that he withdrew to pray. And so it says that he was there all alone. So again, Jesus displays a time of withdrawal from all the crowds and hype as he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, I just want to do one thing. I want to look at one more time where we see this principle. And in my opinion, this is probably the most powerful example of this. But fast forward to what's called Passion Week. Now, Passion Week is simply the week that led up to the crucifixion. And so if you ever hear someone talk about Passion Week, that's all they're referring to is the week that's leading up to all the events that started with a triumphal entry, leading up to the moment where Jesus was crucified. And so fast forward to this Passion Week, and right before he's arrested, we're talking hours before Jesus is arrested, he's eating and he's celebrating the Passover with his disciples. He's celebrating the Passover feast. And after this, what he does is he institutes what we call the Lord's Supper. And so he's doing some awesome things. And shortly after that, Luke 22:39 picks up the story. If you have your Bible, turn to Luke 22. We're looking towards the end at 39. So they've just ate the Passover feast. Jesus has established the Lord's Supper and a couple other things. And we come to this section in verse 39. It says, "And as he came out, he went." And notice what it says right after that. It says, "as was his custom." Now, Jesus made a point to do this throughout his life, but also what you'll notice is if you read through Passion Week, you'll notice that each night Jesus withdraws and goes away. So it says that he came out and he went as was his custom. They were used to this, to the Mount of Olives. And notice the disciples, they followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter temptation." And so he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed. So Jesus leaves his house and he's heading up to the Garden of Gethsemane. And what takes place is his disciples are like, "Oh, Jesus is going, let's follow him." Because they know something is going on. They know something is getting close. They know the hour is coming to where Jesus will be taken from them. And so they decide to follow him. And Jesus says, "Look, I want y'all to stop right here and I want y'all to pray." He gives them reason. He says, "I want y'all to pray so that you won't enter temptation." And he says, "All right, y'all do that, and I'm gonna go spend some time alone." Now, if you remember the story, what takes place is that Jesus withdraws from this, says about a stone's throw, so not very far, still within eyesight. And as Jesus withdraws, if you remember the story, what happens is Jesus starts to pray, and it's the same sequence where we talk about how Jesus started to pray, and he had such sorrow that he literally was sweating drops of blood. Such an intense time that he was experiencing in prayer. And so Jesus, knowing the intensity of the prayer that was about to take place, he says, "You know what, guys, I've got to withdraw. Something big is going on." So Jesus, again, removes himself, and he prays. So we again see this. And here's the thing, is this morning, we only mentioned a few times that Jesus did this throughout the Gospels. But what we know if we study is that this was undoubtedly an essential part, an absolute essential part of Christ's public ministry. If you study throughout the Gospels, you see this time and time again, and the way it words it, you would definitely make the assumption and the idea that Jesus made this a essential part of his public ministry. He did this more than once. The disciples knew because this was his custom to withdraw. And so get that this morning is that essential to Christ's public ministry was his private communion with the Father. Now, I hope we don't miss that this morning. Essential to Christ's public ministry, in other words, everything that he did to the masses, essential to all the good things that he would ever accomplish, was that private communion that he spent with the Father. And there's something very valuable we can learn this morning from that, is that if we're going to accomplish big things for God, there has to be a private time with him as well. There has to be private communion. Public success doesn't take place if we're not privately spending time with God, if we're not privately engaging with him. So, but not only that, this aspect of Christ's ministry, what it did was it caused the disciples to be curious. So the disciples saw that something amazing was happening. And so looking back in chapter 11 of the Gospel of Luke, in Luke 11:1, it says this. It says, "Now Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he had finished," notice this, it says, "one of his disciples said to him, 'Lord, teach us to pray,' as John taught his disciples." And so that leads us to an important crossroads this morning. See, some of us in here, we may want to seek solace. We may want to spend time alone with God, but maybe we just don't quite know how to pray or what to pray for. Well, these disciples were in a similar boat because they saw Jesus praying. They saw what it was accomplishing, and they were like, "You know what, Jesus, teach us how you pray. We want to learn. We want to be like you. We want to imitate your prayer life." So they say, "Jesus, Lord, just teach us. Show us how to pray." And so that leads us to this popular portion of Scripture known as the Lord's Prayer. And you may briefly remember a few weeks ago when I preached, we talked through the Sermon on the Mount, and we studied through that, and we examined it. And in the Sermon on the Mount, it alludes to this. In Matthew 6, it talks about this Lord's Prayer. And so we're just going to look at it because Luke's gospel also alludes to that same exact event. So Luke and Matthew both record this Lord's Prayer. But as we briefly discussed a few weeks ago, the Lord's Prayer is by far one of the most, if not the most known and repeated prayers. If you ask pretty much anybody that's ever spent time in a church to any kind of denomination or whatever, people know the Lord's Prayer. It's common. It's in all sorts of movies. It's in scripts of different stuff. It's in everything. The Lord's Prayer is very common. It's a repeated prayer for many. But as we mentioned then, I don't believe that Jesus desired this to be a repetitive prayer. I believe that Jesus desired this and created this and showed them this to be a representative prayer. And so in other words, the purpose in giving the Lord's Prayer was to better equip all believers to engage and to cultivate a closer communion with God the Father through prayer. In other words, Jesus gave them a prayer. He gave them a model. He gave them an example. And he said, guys, if you do this, not if you just repeat all these words, but if you do this prayer, if you look at this model, what's going to happen is you're going to be equipped to pray. You'll know how to pray and what to pray for, but also you're going to be equipped to engage, to get in communion, to get in contact with the Father through this word. So that's what Jesus was doing, was giving them a representative prayer. And now let's start to connect all the dots this morning. Time after time, Jesus would withdraw from the public. He would withdraw from the busyness, from the white noise of life, and he would get alone. And he would seek communion with the Father. He would withdraw from everything that was going, all the chaos, all of his service, just to commune, just to communicate, to spend time with the Father. His disciples must have seen this countless times, like we mentioned a few moments ago, and they must have saw the effect that it had on him. And therefore, because of that, they come to him and they say, Jesus, look, you got to teach us. You got to help us. We want to understand your prayer life. So Jesus does. He gives them this representative prayer to better equip the disciples. And not only that, but it also better equips us. Because of what he taught the disciples, we're now seeing it. We're now reading about it. And so that everyone who heard this prayer, this Lord's Prayer that we're speaking of, they would be equipped to engage and cultivate a closer communion with the Father through prayer, just as Jesus did. And I hope you see the point this morning is that we have to work. It's a job. We have to work. It doesn't come easy. Now, if you're here this morning and you're like, man, it's hard for me to find quiet time in my schedule. That's the point. Jesus had to work to withdraw. He had to try to dismiss the crowds. He had to try to pull away. And what happened? Sometimes when Jesus would pull away, people would follow. We heard about that right before the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus tries to withdraw from the people, and the people hear about it, and they say, Jesus, show us something. We need something. We need to see some more. So here's what we learn from that is it is difficult and it is a task. It is a job that we must work at to withdraw from the busyness of life. As a parent, sometimes it's difficult to withdraw because the moment you try to withdraw, who comes knocking at your door? Not silence, that's for sure. As a student, sometimes you want to get away, but you recognize, man, I have that homework I should have done roughly 6 hours ago or 6 days ago, and I got to do it now. It happens all the time. It's going to happen to me in about 3 hours. See, it's hard. It takes work to withdraw from the busyness of life, to withdraw from the white noise. So we got to work at it. We got to continue to work to get away and cultivate this closer communion with God by drawing near to him. And withdrawing from this busyness, this white noise, we got to seek him in prayer. And so with that in mind, there's countless principles. We could spend hours upon hours just talking about things that we can learn, but I just want to point out two things to you this morning. I want to point out two things. The first thing is this, is that we learn through all this study is that Jesus encouraged us to withdraw in prayer to be strengthened for our next task. That's the first thing. Jesus said, I want you to withdraw for this reason. He showed us this example because as we withdraw, it strengthens us for the next task. So in life, you're going to have task after task after task coming up. And without withdrawing, you don't have strength. You don't have the power to commence and to go forward. And so Jesus, we see that he made it a point after all these major miracles to withdraw so he could be built back up to continue his incredible service. So each time he would pray, he would withdraw. He was strengthened through his close communion with the Father. And here's the thing. If Jesus Christ in the flesh had to withdraw to gain strength or to move forward, don't you think you and I need to? Now get this. Jesus was omnipotent. He was part of the creation of the world. But in his human form, he allowed himself to feel weak. And so he came to this communion with God to be encouraged, to be rejuvenated by the Spirit. And as he prayed, he would be strengthened for the next task. And again, if Jesus had to, I'm pretty sure we need to, because we are weak. We are people desperately in need of God to give us his strength, to give us his power. But in addition to that, Jesus encouraged us to withdraw in prayer to be strengthened for our next temptation. Now, this is a huge one. I want us to get this morning. Jesus strengthened us. He says, I want you to withdraw. Spend time with me, because as you do, you're going to be strengthened for our next temptation. Look with me back at Luke 22. After Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw from his disciples, he began to pray, and when he returned to them, he found them sleeping. Jesus said, hey, look, I need you to stay here and pray. And when he comes back, he finds them sleeping. And what he says in Luke 22:46 is this. He says, why are you sleeping? Didn't I tell you to be praying? He says, why are you sleeping? So he says, rise and pray. Get up. Wake up. Pray. Notice why. He says, so that you may not enter into temptation. Jesus had already told his disciples in verse 40 to pray so they might not enter temptation. And now he returns to find them sleeping. And again, he urges them. He says, guys, I need you to pray so that in order to get away from this temptation, so that you will to be prepared for temptation, so you won't fall into this trap. So there's a very, very powerful principle that he presents there. And it's this, is as a child of God, we have the power and we have the ability to proactively pray through our temptation, through our sin, not just reactively. Now, here's what I mean by that, is that Jesus was making the point that if we are in a close communion with God, we can pray proactively before our temptation, not just reactively after we sin. Here's the thing. When we come to sin in life, oftentimes what we do is we sit back and we look and we say, God, man, I messed up. I probably shouldn't have done that. And we start thinking about all the steps that got us to that sin. We're like, God, we shouldn't have been there. God, I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? And here's what's awesome is God does every time. But what Jesus says is you can be empowered before you ever reach that temptation by withdrawing and praying. He says, disciples, y'all need to withdraw so you can proactively, so you can prepare yourself to enter into temptation. Because what Jesus knows and what we all know is you will enter into temptation. You can either come prepared in a close communion with God through seeking solace in him, seeking stillness, or you can come in completely not aware. And what that always leaves us doing is praying reactively and saying, God, I'm sorry, I messed up. It's all about being proactive in our prayer. So Jesus says that. He says, do not fall into temptation. Pray that you may not enter temptation. And as I mentioned, these are just two of the principles. We could talk for hours about this. Jesus also strengthened in prayer when he withdrew for tragedy. We saw that when John the Baptist is beheaded, he immediately responds. He says, you know what, I'm going to get away. Jesus will strengthen us in times of tragedy. All these because of withdrawing. There is a desperate need for us to do that. And so that tells us there's a dire need for believers to withdraw from the busyness of life. We've got to pull back. And even if that busyness, get this, even if that busyness is to serve God, even if we are busy with all the right things, we still have to withdraw and commune with God. I want you to notice, did Jesus ever do anything bad? No, he was perfect. He was sinless. So what does that tell you about all the things that Jesus was busy doing? Every single one of them was good. They were all in good sight of God. But Jesus still withdrew. So even if you're busy with all the right things, if you're doing all the good stuff, you're going to church, you're doing this, you're reading, you're serving people, you're meeting the needs of the needy, if you do all that and you don't withdraw to pray, there's a problem. There's an issue. Jesus did all the right things, and yet there was still a dire need for him to withdraw and seek communion with God. And so for us, we could say the same thing, that even if we're good and busy with all the right things, we simply have to withdraw and commune with the Father. As we mentioned earlier, that we are in an age that encourages multitasking. Many of us have become accustomed to that, and myself included. I enjoy busyness. I enjoy white noise going on behind me, and I get so much done when I do. But God desires us to withdraw and spend time with him. God desires us just to pull back and commune and just connect with him one-on-one. And may I add something this morning really quick, is communication and connecting with God, it's a two-way street. I hope we get this morning. This is something that I've been working on a ton, and I'm not there because I forget communication is a two-way street. And if you think it's not, try a relationship on a one-way street of communication. It's not going to work very long. Speaking with God is the same way. It's communication, two-way street. Here's what I mean by that is that the Bible promises that as we draw near to God, God's going to draw near to us. Here's what that means is that we have the ability to talk to God, ask for things. That's awesome. But we also have the ability to just stop and listen. Two-way street. We can communicate, we can ask things, but how about let's take time to stop. Just listen for the words of God. Listen for the movement, the actions of God. Stop and just take a step back and examine our life and see how God's moving. See the goodness that he's doing. See the blessings that he's giving us. There is a dire need for us to step back because it's okay to take a break from talking. It's okay to take a break from asking for things and simply listen to him. And it's okay to be still and find solace in the strength of his presence. It's okay. It's a two-way street. So church, let's cultivate a new culture within our lives, especially within our personal walks with Christ. Let's follow his example. He set forth a perfect example of how to withdraw and how to seek the Father. Let's just get away from everything. Let's be still. Let's commune with the Father. Let's find solace or comfort in the strength of his presence. That's easy. That's all it's about. It's hard to withdraw. It's a task. It's a work. But God says if you do it, you're going to be strengthened. For the task at hand, for the temptation, for your tragedy, whatever it is, you'll be strengthened. We need that this morning.